All right, welcome to part 4 in our exploration of Indian and Southeast Asian art. We've been talking about Buddhism. We're going to be looking at some Buddhist architecture. So, can a mound of dirt represent the Buddha, the path to enlightenment, a mountain, and the universe all at the same time? It can if it's a stupa, and this is what you're looking at. The stupa, and that's Sanskrit for heap, is an important form of Buddhist architecture. Though it predates Buddhism, it is generally considered to be kind of a burial sort of monument, a place of burial, or a receptacle for religious objects. At its simplest, a stupa is a dirt mound faced with stone. In Buddhism, the earliest stupas contained portions of the Buddha's ashes, and as a result, the stupa began to be associated with the body of the Buddha. So you can almost think of it as like a reliquary, although Buddha is not a saint. But there's similar parallels when we think of Christian saints and the way they're buried, or parts of the relics are housed. Adding the Buddha's ashes to the mound of dirt activated it with the energy of the Buddha himself. Early stupas. Before Buddhism, great teachers were buried in mounds. Some were cremated, but sometimes they were buried in a seated, meditative position. The mound of earth covered them up. Thus, the dome shape of the stupa came to represent a person seated in meditation, much as the Buddha was when he achieved enlightenment and knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. The base of the stupa represents his crossed legs as he sat in a meditative pose called Padmasana. So I'm going to say that again, Padmasana, or the Lotus Position. The middle portion is the Buddha's body, and at the top of the mound, where a pole rises from the apex, surrounded by a small fence, and this represents his head. Before images of the human Buddha were created, reliefs often depicted practitioners demonstrating devotions to stupa. So actually the architecture, really, this was, before actual pictures of Buddha started being reproduced, this was the way to represent the figure. The ashes of the Buddha were buried in stupas built at locations associated with important events in the Buddhist life, including Lumbini, where he was born, Bodha Gaya, where he achieved enlightenment, Deer Park at Sarnath, where he preached his first sermon sharing the Four Noble Truths, also called the Dharma or the Law, and Kishnagara, where he died. The choice of these sites and others were based on both real and legendary events. So again, this really falls in line with what we've been talking about in relation to sacred spaces, that location, and usually the location has some sort of, sacred significance. According to the legend, King Ashoka, who was the first king to embrace Buddhism, he ruled over most of India, most of the Indian subcontinent from 269 to 232 BCE, created 84,000 stupas and divided the Buddha's ashes among them all. While this is an exaggeration, and the stupas were built by Ashoka some 250 years after the Buddha's death, it is clear that Ashoka was responsible for building many stupas all over northern India and the other territories under the Mauryan dynasty in areas known as Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. One of Ashoka's goals was to provide new converts with the tools to help their new faith. In this, Ashoka was following the directions of the Buddha, who prior to his death, and this is Parinirvana, directed that stupas should be erected in places other than those associated with key monuments of his life, so that the heart of many shall be made calm and glad. Ashoka also built stupas in regions where people might have difficulty reaching the stupa that contained the Buddha's ashes. So what you're looking at is one of the most famous stupas, the Great Stupa, and this was built at the birthplace of Ashoka's wife. And this is the one that is in your list of 250 works that you have to know for the AP College Board. So the practice of building stupas spread with the Buddhist doctrine to Nepal and Tibet, Bhutan, Thailand, Burma, China, and even the United States, where large Buddhist communities are centered. While stupas have changed in form over the years, their function remains essentially unchanged. Stupas remind the Buddhist practitioner of the Buddha and his teaching almost 25,000 years after his death. From Buddhist, building stupas also has a karmic benefit. Karma, a key component in both Hinduism and Buddhism, is the energy generated by a person's actions and the ethical consequences of those actions. Karma affects a person's next existence or rebirth. For example, in the Abdana Sutra, 10 merits of building a stupa are outlined. One states that if a practitioner builds a stupa, he or she will not be reborn in a remote location and will not suffer from extreme poverty. As a result, a vast number of stupas dot the countryside in Tibet, where they are called Khorten, and in Burma, Chidi. Buddhists visit stupas to perform rituals that help them to achieve one of the most important goals of Buddhism, to understand the Buddhist teachings known as the Four Noble Truths. This is also known as Dharma and the law. So when they die, they cease to be caught up in samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death. The Four Noble Truths are: 1, life is suffering. Suffering equals rebirth. Sorry, my notes are a little confusing. Number 2, the cause of suffering is desire. Number 3, the cause of desire must be overcome. Number 4, when desire is overcome, there is no more suffering. Suffering equals rebirth. Once individuals come to fully understand the Four Noble Truths, they are able to achieve enlightenment or the complete knowledge of the Dharma. In fact, Buddha means the enlightened one, and it is the knowledge that the Buddha gained on his way to achieving enlightenment that Buddhist practitioners seek on their own journey toward enlightenment. So one of the early sutras, a collection of sayings attributed to the Buddha forming a religious text, records that the Buddha gave specific directions regarding the appropriate method of honoring his remains. His ashes were to be buried in a stupa at the crossing of the mythical four great roads, the four directions of space, the unmoving hub of the wheel, the place of enlightenment. If one thinks of the stupa as a circle or wheel, the unmoving central symbolizes enlightenment. The unmoving center symbolizes enlightenment. Likewise, the practitioner achieves stillness and peace when the Buddhist Dharma is fully understood. Many stupas are placed on a square base, and the four sides represent the four directions: north, south, east, and west. Each side often has a gate in the center, which allows the practitioner to enter from any side. The gates are called Tarana. Each gate also represents the four great life events of the Buddha. So east is Buddha's birth, south represents his enlightenment, west his first sermon where he preached his teachings or dharma, and north nirvana. The gates are turned at right angles to the axis mundi to indicate movement in the manner of the arms of Svastika, a directional symbol that in Sanskrit means to be good. Su, S-U, S-U, yes, means good or auspicious, and asti, A-S-T-I, means to be. The Tirana are directional gates guiding the practitioner in the correct direction on the correct path to enlightenment, the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. Well, I apologize. It's not a very good slide. I'll see if I can fix that. At the top of a stupa is a yasti or a spiral. So this is it over here, which symbolizes the axis mundi, a line through the Earth's center around which the universe is thought to revolve. The yasti is spelled Y-A-S-T-I, is surrounded by a harmika, and this is a gate or fence, and it is topped by kshatras, umbrella-like objects symbolizing royalty and protection. So here here's the harmika, and I think these are the kshatras over here. Sorry about the slide. I didn't realize it was so pixelated. The stupa makes visible something that is so large as to be unimaginable. The axis symbolizes at the center of the cosmos, partitioning the world into 6 directions: north, south, east, west, the nadir, and the zenith. And that's spelled N-A-D-I-R, and zenith, Z-E-N-I-T-H. This central axis, the axis mundi, is echoed in the same axis that bisects the human body. In this manner, the human body also functions as a microcosm of the universe. The spinal column is the axis that bisects Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of the Buddhist world, and around which the world pivots. The aim of the practitioner is to climb the mountain of one's own mind, ascending stage by stage through the planes of increasing levels of enlightenment. The practitioner does not enter the stupa. It is a solid object. Instead, the practitioner circumambulates, walks around it as a meditational practice, focusing on the Buddhist teachings. Now, when we studied Hindu temples, they also incorporated circumambulation. This movement suggests the endless cycle of rebirth, samsara, and the spokes of the Eightfold Path, 8 guidelines that assist the practitioner, that leads to the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths and into the center of the unmoving hub of the wheel, enlightenment. This walking meditation at a stupa enables the practitioner to visualize enlightenment as the movement from the perimeter of the stupa to the unmoving hub at the center, marked by the yasti. So it's interesting, whereas in a church, worshipers would actually enter the interior and congregate. Here, the structure is meant to sort of walk around. So it functions in a very different way. The practitioner can walk to circumambulate the stupa or move around it through a series of prostrations, a movement that brings the practitioner's body down low to the ground in a position of submission. And that is something that Islamic worshippers do. They do prostrate themselves when they pray to Mecca. An energetic and circular movement around the stupa raises the body's temperature. Practitioners do this to mimic the heat of the fire that cremated the Buddha's body, a process that burned away the bonds of selfhood and attachment to the mundane or ordinary world. Attachments to the earthly realm are considered obstacles in the path toward enlightenment. Circumambulation is not veneration for the relics themselves, a distinction sometimes lost on novice practitioners. The Buddha did not want to be revered as a god, but wanted his ashes in the stupa to serve as a reminder of the Four Noble Truths. So here you're sort of looking at it, a diagram and an elevation of a stupa. Small stupas can function as votive offerings, objects that serve as the focal point for acts of devotion. In order to gain merit to improve one's karma, individuals could sponsor the casting of a votive stupa. Indian and Tibetan stupas typically have inscriptions that state that the stupa was made, quote, so that all beings may attain enlightenment. Votive stupas can be consecrated and used in home altars or utilized in monastic shrines. Since they are small, they can easily be transported. Votive stupas, along with the small statues of the Buddha and other Buddhist deities, were carried across Nepal, over the Himalayas, and into Tibet, helping to spread Buddhist doctrine. Votive stupas are often carved from stone or cast in bronze. The bronze stupa can also serve as a reliquary, and ashes of important teachers can be encased inside. This stupa clearly shows the link between the form of the stupa and the body of the Buddha. The Buddha is represented at his moment of enlightenment, where he receives the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, the Dharma or law. He is making the earth touching gesture, and I'm not going to try to pronounce this, but I will spell it, Bhumisparsamudra. So Bhumisparsamudra. Anyway, I'll get this. This is going to take time for me to go through and learn all these pronunciations. And is seated in Padmasan, Padmasan, and this is the lotus position. So you just say lotus position. He is seated in a gateway signifying a sacred space that recalls the gates of each side of monumental stupas. So you can kind of see him here. It's very tiny. Kind of zero in. I probably should have done that when I was talking. Alright, so we're going to travel to Afghanistan, where we're going to be looking at some large-scale Buddhas. These no longer exist anymore. They were destroyed in 2001 by the Taliban. Prior to their recent destruction, the 16th and 7th century rock-cut Buddhist sculptures in the Bamiyan Valley of central Afghanistan were considered the largest in the world. Known collectively as the Bamiyan Buddhas, the two monumental sculptures have amazed both Buddhist and non-Buddhist visitors for more than 1,000 years. Like many of the world's great ancient monuments, little is known about who commissioned the Bamiyan Buddhas or the sculptors who carved them. However, their very existence points to the importance of the Buddhist faith and the Bamiyan Valley during this period. So, Bamiyan is located between the Indian subcontinent to the southeast and Central Asia to the north, which made it an important location close to one of the most important branches of the Silk Route. The Silk Route was an ancient series of linked trade routes that connected the east to the west and carried both material wealth and ideas. Bamiyan's central location along the Silk Route, along with its fertile plains amid harsh terrain, made it an ideal location for merchants and missionaries to stop during their travels. Many of the missionaries and merchants in this area during the middle of the first millennium were practitioners of the Buddhist faith. Buddhism had long been an important religion in the region, having been introduced during the early Kushan period. The Kushan emperor controlled the region that now consists of Afghanistan, Pakistan, northern India, and parts of China. It lasted from the 2nd century BCE until the 3rd century CE. Buddhism spread in part because it was not location specific. Believers did not need to worship at a particular temple or a particular site as part of their practice. Worship could take place anywhere and at any time. This freedom resulted in the emergence of Buddhist cave architecture throughout Asia. This is a view of what it looks like today. If one visits Bamiyan today, one will see nearly 1,000 Buddhist caves carved along the 1,300 meters of cliff face. It is against this backdrop of carved caves that the two monumental Buddha images were carved. So you can actually see the niches of where they used to be. Monumental Buddhas. Prior to their destruction in 2001, the two monumental Buddha sculptures could be seen carved into the cliff facing the Bamiyan Valley. The larger of the two figures located on the western end, and that's the right in the photo, measured 175 feet in height. The art historian Susan Huntington also argued that it represented the Buddha Var Ochana. The smaller of the two monument statues located in the east depicted the Buddha Shakyamuni. The figure was also, and I guess these are different sort of representations of the Buddha. The figure was also enormous and measured, that figure was also enormous and measured 120 feet in height. So Sha'ana is a celestial or transcendent Buddha. Shakyamuni, also called Siddhartha Gautama, is the historical Buddha who is believed to have lived sometime between the 6th and 4th century BCE. So, both images were carved into niches of the cliff side in high relief. The area near the head of both Buddha figures and the area around the larger Buddha's feet were carved in the round, allowing the worshipper to circumambulate. Circumambulation, which is the act of walking around an object such as a stupa, a reliquary mound, that's what a stupa is, or an image of the Buddha, is a common practice in Buddhist worship. So definitely that circumambulation is going to be one of your vocabulary words that you should definitely know. The two large Buddha images reflected the international environment of the Bamiyan Valley and were influenced by the art and cultures of India, Central Asia, and even ancient Greek culture. For example, both Buddhas wore flowing robes and have been described as having wavy curls of hair. So this hairstyle and the flowing drapery are elements rooted in early Gandharan Buddhist imagery that combined Hellenistic Greek traditions of representation with Indian subject matter. Gandhara was the name of a region of Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan that was conquered by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. So that makes sense that you would have this sort of Hellenistic influence. And definitely when you look here, you can see that Hellenistic animation of drapery and the flowing drapery in this depiction of the Buddha. Alexander vastly expanded the Greek Empire and introduced classical art and culture to the regions he controlled. This Hellenistic influence was adopted by the Buddhist artists of Gandhara and influenced representations there for hundreds of years. Much of what we know about the monumental Buddha sculptures come from the Chinese monk, I'm going to spell it, Xuanzang, who traveled to Bamiyan in 643 and documented his travels in the text, the Great Tang records of the Western regions. As the earlier text described, the Buddha images, the Chinese monk's writing provides us with remarkable descriptions of the sculptures and the vibrant communities that inhabited the region. He wrote, "When merchants coming and going happened to witness visions of heavenly deities, whether as good omens or as predictions of disaster, they worship the deities to pray for blessedness. There are several pens of monasteries with several thousand monks who follow the Hinayana teachings of the Lotus Travada school. To the northeast of the city, there is a corner of the mountain, a rock statue of the Buddha standing 140 or 50 feet in height, a dazzling golden color and adorned with brilliant gems. To the east, there is a monastery built by a previous king of the country. To the east of the monastery, there is a copper statue of the Buddha standing more than 100 feet tall. It was cast in separate pieces and then welded together into shape. Sorry for a minute. Do you mind if I read? Just kidding. These descriptions of the Buddha provide us great insight into not only what they might have looked like in the 7th century, but also how they were engaged with the community around them. Perhaps most surprisingly to our modern experience with the Buddha imagery is that the monumental rock-cut sculptures are described as being adorned with metal, color, and gems, not stripped down as we often see them in museums and galleries. And often we look at a lot of sculptures, that were either painted or adorned. We are so used to seeing any type of ancient sculpture sort of in its natural state, and that's not the context of how it was supposed to be viewed. So keep that in mind. Scholars agreed that both images were covered in pigments of various hues so that they appeared to be made of metal and other materials, but that they were not cast entirely of copper, as one visitor suggested of the smaller Buddha image that was described earlier. However, such scholars have argued that both the monumental Buddhist faces were constructed of masks made of wood clad by a thin layer of brass, which were inserted onto ledges that appear above the lower lips of both images. Another scholar argues that the cuts to the faces were a later iconoclastic act. So remember, iconoclasm comes from the Greek word meaning to break images. This is a long tragic history of the willful destruction of artwork for short-term political gain, often under the guise of religious beliefs. We first encountered iconoclasm with the Byzantine era. Major iconoclastic spasms include the Byzantine iconoclasms of the 8th and 9th century, the destruction of Catholic artwork during the Protestant Reformation, and then lastly, during the French Revolution, which we will talk about when we get to 18th century art. And most recently, the crimes committed by ISIL against the people and cultural heritage of Iraq and Syria. While there is a debate over the material and treatment of the Buddha's face, we know that the pigments were applied to the stucco that covered the stone surfaces of the sculptures. Stucco helped to even out the textured rock surface. One can imagine what a powerful impression these monumental Buddhas would have made on passerbys and worshippers. Mullah Omar ordered Taliban forces to demolish the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001. The destruction was complete. Only outlines of the figures and a few details remain. The direction to destroy the Buddha images was motivated in part by the Taliban's extreme iconoclastic campaign, as well as their disdain for Western interest and funding that had gone to protecting the images while there was an intense and growing need for humanitarian aid in the region. the Taliban's claim that destroying the Buddha sculptures was an Islamic act is belied by the fact that Bamiyan had become predominantly Muslim by the 10th century, and that the sculptures had, up until 2001, remained largely intact. The destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas was a huge loss for our understanding of human history. However, even in the darkness, light has a way of emerging. Since their destruction, several new discoveries have been made near the site of Bamiyan Buddhas, including the discovery of fragments of a 62-foot long reclining Buddha. All right, so I'm going to stop here. We're going to continue in our exploration of Buddhism, and we're going to be looking at some other Buddhas from other regions, so stay tuned.